Hello everybody and welcome to the TDO show. Today, we'll be finding out who the real father of 85-year-old Marvel Comics is. Is it Stan Lee, world-renowned writer, often credited for creating characters like Spider-Man,
my name's the Human Spider.
I don't care, get out.
No.
Iron Man, and the Hulk? We looked at the DNA test for the results. Maury, please let us know the results for the case of Stan Lee and Marvel Comics.
When it comes to
Marvel,
sir, you are not the father.
Oh no, what a disaster. We still have one more potential father to get through though. Jack... Who is this guy? Jack Kirby, whoever that is, our next potential father.
company,
Maury, please give us the results.
You are the father.
Okay, let's slow down for a bit. Marvel has always been one of, if not the top dog of comics. They've managed to even dominate mainstream non-comic media, with Avengers Endgame being the second highest grossing film of all time. And for as long as I can remember, the man that's been credited for all of this was none other than Stan Lee.
You know, I guess one person can make a difference.
Lovable, goofy Stan Lee. Just look at him.
You are my son.
But what if I told you he wasn't as innocent as he seemed? What if I told you the empire he is so often credited for creating isn't really even his? The truth is, there was another person who worked right alongside Stan Lee, the artist that every writer needs. Someone to bring an idea maker's ideas to life, to where they're no longer just ideas. After all, art is one of the main things that makes a comic book a comic book. In fact, not only did this person fulfill the visual art needs, but also many of the narrative art needs, often writing full storylines and creating some of the most iconic characters we know today. This man was none other than the legendary Jack Kirby. Jack Kirby added so much life to Marvel Comics that transcended just the pages. He added that flair that gave every Marvel story something to marvel at. If Stan Lee was the brain behind Marvel, Jack Kirby was the heart. From awards to industry recognition, Kirby is a staple of comics history. To really display how influential he was, take a quick second and guess which of these characters he worked to create. If you said A, B, C, or D, you were wrong. The answer is actually option E, all of the above. Simply put, Kirby was essential in building and co-creating numerous characters from Ant-Man.
There's a lot of chatter out there asking why I didn't shrink down, go in, and kill Thanos.
The Fantastic Four, Hulk, Iron Man, Black Panther, Thor, and the list just goes on. However, in the modern era, whenever the subject of Marvel pops up, people only really think of Stan Lee, and while many comic readers know and praise Jack Kirby, Kirby's praise pales in comparison to Stan Lee's. Don't believe us? Test it out yourself. Ask your parents who Stan Lee is and who Jack Kirby is and see what they say. Hey mom, you know who Stan Lee is? What about Jack Kirby?
I do not fucking care. You should be asking who the fuck your father is since he ran out on us ever since he saw your absolutely disgusting face in the delivery room. You have no job, no girls, no money. And here you are asking me who the fuck Stan Lee and Jack Kirby are. Isn't Kirby a fucking Nintendo character that I caught you
Okay, that's enough out of her. The truth is, Kirby's history with Marvel, and specifically Stan Lee, is an extremely dark and messy one. One that deals with the place of writers and artists, and the problems with improperly or unjustly crediting people for their artistic work. And one thing we all know is that history is often written by the victors. But before we get to the so-called real-life Marvel Civil War, let's set the scene.
Our story begins with the Silver Age of Comics, a transitory period following the Second World War. During this time, DC Comics, then called National Comics Publication, held a vast majority control of the market share of the comics industry, pushing out patriotic war comics. However, after the war, audiences grew tired of reading about war comics and demanded for more fantastical stories, leading to a shift in the comic book market, one that would see the rise of DC's biggest rivals, Marvel Comics. Born to an Austrian Jewish immigrant family, Jack Kirby grew up on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Being a new immigrant in the bustling cityscape of New York, Kirby had a slightly rough childhood. Kirby often found himself getting into fights, leading to him trying to find outlets to express himself, the biggest one being doodling. Over time, Kirby's life would only be getting harder and harder to deal with. One of his closest friends ended up dying in a ship hijacking, only further placing the pressure on Kirby to make it out. In his teenage years, Kirby would stumble across numerous comic books, and through this would open a Pandora's box, enlightening him of the power of stories, but cursing him with a gift that would eventually torment him. By reading comic books, Kirby found a way to escape his rough neighborhood and enter into this fantasy world. With a way to escape from his reality, Kirby did everything and anything to build his own worlds. Leaning more and more into drawing, Kirby picked up new techniques whenever he could. From there, at 14 years old, Jack Kirby would enroll himself into the Pratt Institute, an art school in Brooklyn. Pratt is known for its art program, being highly esteemed and a great accomplishment for Kirby. Surprisingly, Kirby dropped out just the afternoon of his first day at Pratt. This was mainly due to financial pressures. With Kirby needing to provide for his family, school became less of a priority, instead trying to find practical work to pay the bills. This would lead Kirby continuing to perfect his craft in the late 1930s, landing himself entry-level positions as an artist for National Comics and Marvel Comics, where he would respectively work on titles from Blue Beetle and Captain America. However, across the pond in the late 1930s, a bigger concern had re-emerged.
On the other side of the planet, the biggest war of all recorded human history was taking place. The Allies were losing the war to the Axis powers, and it seemed like humanity was about to take the darkest turn we've ever had. To aid in the fight, the United States of America teamed up with the Allies to fight for what they valued.
You son of a bitch!
This new involvement by America led to a major cultural shift in the country, with patriotism being as prevalent in the country as it's ever been. Along with this shift, comics were no exception. The storylines were now as patriotic and chock full of good old American values, serving as a sort of propaganda. Leading this change was none other than Jack Kirby, who was writing seminal runs of Captain America at the time, who was very blatantly an extremely patriotic character. Kirby wasn't an exception to the patriotism either, as he even ended up changing his original Austrian Jewish name, Jacob Kurtzberg, to the now iconic Jack Kirby. This was, in his own words, to feel more American. It didn't stop there, though, as the next step in Kirby's patriotism was one far bigger: conscripting into the American military. He would be sent as a reconnaissance man to Europe, specifically for the deadly invasion of Normandy, otherwise known as D-Day. 29,000. That is the amount of US soldiers that would be lost on D-Day. Kirby would survive, but would never forget about the time he spent during the war and the sacrifice of the real-life heroes that helped shape the world in which he could return to. Driven by an immense amount of patriotism and hope, Kirby was inspired to translate what he had bore witness to into the pages he would draw. Upon his return to New York after the war, Kirby opted to return to the Marvel team, finding himself during this new age of comics. Throughout his time in comics, well before the war, Kirby was defined as being a very imaginative artist with ideas of blending a lot of magical elements into his grounded work, creating almost new worlds with each and every character he came up with. Keep in mind that at the time, comics weren't so engrossed in fantasy superhero-like traits as they are today, still being grounded in reality and portraying real-life stories, so Kirby was very revolutionary at the time. In doing so, Marvel knew what they would use Kirby for. Kirby would be the driving force to make Marvel the biggest comics publisher of the post-war era. It was all right there. From the out there ideas to the bombastic drawings and creatures, Kirby's imagination had no end to it. However, there was still one glaring issue. Kirby's imagination had no end to it, making it extremely hard for editors and publishers to try and tone down his work for the audience. It seemed harder and harder to accommodate for this immense creativity and ground it into comic strips, making Jack Kirby's reign a shaky one. However, just when it seemed like Kirby's saving grace to an already rough life was being ripped away from him, the man that would seemingly change the face of comic books forever came to create one of the most iconic comic duos in history. Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, Tarantino and Samuel L. Jackson, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, your fist and the drywall after losing your 6th ranked game of the night. These are some of the most iconic duos that have given fans the most spectacular and memorable moments of their respective realms. Jack Kirby and Stan Lee fit right in, absolutely revolutionizing comics and giving fans stories and worlds they couldn't get anywhere else. They pioneered comics together like the X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and the Hulk, which are all huge names now with big movie franchises, TV shows, toys, comics, and essentially still integral parts to pop culture 60 years later. We'd say it's just an undeniable fact that they pretty much grandfathered the Marvel Cinematic Universe as we know it today, with not only their characters, worlds, and stories being used, but their amazing creative flair.
The Fantastic Four is to this day considered as their magnum opus because of how they were able to create the first ever superhero group to blend elements of the supernatural with what it means to be a part of a family. Then from there, the two of them were able to add to their world with the Inhumans, Galactus, Silver Surfer, Black Panther, and Namor within the same year. But it didn't stop there. The two of them were able to create and add different pockets to the Marvel universe, including the Negative Zone, Skrull planets, and even go as far as to introduce Atlantis to Marvel.
Their popularity would skyrocket, with Kirby's writing, art, and creativity popularizing the fantasy-like superhero stories that comics would soon become synonymous with, and Stan Lee's editorial and marketing skills that would keep Marvel in the public eye and give the fans exactly what they wanted every single time. It just felt like they couldn't miss.
This motherfucker don't miss.
With each book doing better than the last. While fans were absolutely loving this duo, things behind the scenes weren't as great as people thought.
Have you ever told a joke in class and watched someone in front of you steal the joke word for word and get the whole class laughing like they had their own Netflix special? Well, this sums up the relationship between Kirby and Lee. As you know, Jack Kirby handled the art while Stan Lee focused on creating the worlds we know and love today. At least, this is how it was sold. The truth is, Stan Lee was really more of an editor and spokesperson for Marvel, with Kirby and other writers really being the brains behind the stories. However, Stan's influence cannot be denied. He was exactly what Marvel needed, someone grounded and relatable that could truly sell and ground the ideas Marvel created. In fact, it was hard to find a comic that wasn't branded with the iconic Stan Lee Presents.
Just by virtue of the two contrasting personalities of both Kirby and Lee, it's a tale as old as time of what happened next. Stan Lee, with his extroverted personality, became the face of both of their works, even going as far as being pushed by the whole of Marvel to represent the both of them, becoming chief editor of the entire publication. He really was the perfect face of the company, being so charismatic and just an extremely likable guy in the public eye. Now, even though Kirby served just as big of a role, or even more so, as Stan in their comments, Marvel saw an opportunity with Stan's popularity. In marketing, one of the most important things to capitalize on is a popular face or personality, as they're easier to identify and trust amongst consumers. Being able to associate a face or a person to a product is what makes so many companies successful, and why celebrities get paid so much to represent brands. This would lead into Stan Lee being solely credited for the work that both Lee and Kirby did, specifically the creation of the Fantastic Four, one of the co-creations that Kirby held very dearly to his heart. Understandably, when Lee was given the credit for both their works and kept going with it, Kirby became frustrated. They had both spent time crafting these now iconic stories, so why should it be that only one of them walks away with the glory of it? This kept going for a while, and the cracks began to form between their partnerships. At the time, Marvel started spreading Stan Lee's ideas and visions across the company as if he were Kim Jong-un and Marvel was North Korea. Anyways, by using the same vision across all their writers and artists, Marvel Comics would become a lot more uniform and consistent, and follow the same formulas that keep that iconic Stan Lee marketing and feel.
Many agreed with this, but some did not appreciate this policing from Marvel executives. Many writers and artists at Marvel would see Lee as sort of a fraud that gets to take credit for their creations just because he was slightly charismatic. In recent times, this oversight of Stan Lee would be entitled the Marvel Method. The Marvel Method consisted of Lee giving out a general plot outline to artists and forcing artists to fill in the blanks and come up with a final product. And in the end, Lee would take most, if not all, the credit. Stan Lee was even quoted saying the following, alluding to the famous Marvel Method. Some artists, such as Jack Kirby, need no plot at all. I mean, I'll just say to Jack, let's let the next villain be Dr. Doom. Or I may not even say that. He may tell me, and then he goes home and does it. He's so good at plots. I'm sure he's 1,000 times better than I. He just about makes up the plots for these stories. All I do is a little editing. I may tell him that he's gone too far in one direction or another. Of course, occasionally I'll give him a plot, but we're practically both the writers on these things.
You know, There is something called the Marvel method of writing comics, which is really the Stan Lee method. And I used to write them that way. I'd write the script, give it to the artist, and he would draw it. But I couldn't write them fast enough. And these artists were so brilliant, and they were so good at story themselves, that I would say to the artist, look, this is the plot I want. And I would either tell them in a few words what the story was, or I would write an outline on a page or 2 pages or a few paragraphs. And I'd say, you go ahead and draw it any way you want. It doesn't matter. I'll put the words in and tie it all together. And they did that. And it worked out beautifully.
Honestly, one thing to make clear is that while this is unfair to the other writers and artists, it wasn't necessarily Lee's fault. Sure, you could argue he sold them out, but it was honestly a great business decision by Marvel. Lee still was the main propagator of Marvel Comics, and to this day serves as the iconic face of the company, and just gives it a very genuine feeling, which is something very important for a company to have to connect with its audience. At the end of the day, Marvel was making more money, the artists and writers were making more money, and their work was being shown to more people, and Stan Lee was the hero of Marvel. Ironically though, one thing we've learned from Marvel itself is that heroes tend to disagree.
Looking from the perspective of Kirby, it's easy to see why things went so badly. To him, Lee, like that one guy who asked for your homework answers every single day, kept abusing the Marvel method and by extension used Kirby's talent to further his own career while leaving Kirby in the dust. Kirby, who once saw Lee as his friend, came to believe that their friendship was nothing more than a parasitic business relationship. Not getting recognition from the public is one thing, but to not be respected within the company you work at and you being deemed not marketable enough to be credited for your own work is just a punch in the gut.
The rift only became greater as the pair created more and more new characters for the Marvel world, as each new character was just a new resentment to hold. Ultimately, at the end of the 70s, Kirby started having real verbal disputes with Lee and the entirety of Marvel as to who actually owns the rights to the characters in which they both created. Kirby would insist that they were his works and demand proper credit and compensation, but Marvel would refuse to give Kirby credits alone and to always attribute Stan Lee to whatever Jack Kirby claimed he created. With how poorly Kirby's artistic mind was being treated by the very people he worked for, it eventually had to escalate from just internally repressed resentment. Inevitably, Kirby would have to take his issues with Marvel to another level, a lawsuit, whose details we'll go into a bit later into this video. This conflict between Kirby and Marvel would last years, pitting two former colleagues against each other in what we'd like to call a civil war. With a frustrated Kirby, the Marvel team did not know what to do with him. Being a clear liability to the brand and the overall reputation of Stan Lee, the face of the company, Marvel had no choice but to blackball him. Practically by giving him no work but still keeping him on contract, Marvel was able to, for a while, put a muzzle on Kirby whilst retaining his talents on their side. However, this is the same Kirby that grew up in a rough neighborhood to immigrants, lost his friends in tragedies, went to war, and lived to tell the tale, with the only thing as his escape through all of this being comic books. To put it bluntly, one thing you can't stop is a man with dreams to gain and nothing to lose.
One thing to remember, though, is that Marvel wasn't the only player in this game. How about we check in with the rivals? At DC Comics, the company was going under some restructuring, with a new editorial director coming into play, Carmine Infantino. Infantino was a lover of comics, but the one thing he loved more than comics was winning. I mean, with a name like his, what would you expect? I mean, he literally sounds straight out of The Godfather. Just hearing the name makes me shiver.
Carmine Infantino.
Growing up as a National Comics fan and working during the Silver Age renaissance of Marvel, Carmine would bear witness to the rise of the Marvel Empire whilst he worked on classics like Flash, Adam Strange, reviving more Batman comics while creating Batgirl and other DC characters like Elongated Man. After years of dedication with the DC team, Infantino was promoted to be a part of the editorial team, allowing him to run a lot of DC Comics operations at the time. With a competitive mindset against the rising Marvel Empire, Infantino knew the best way to prepare for war was to recruit soldiers that could be used in his battles. Infantino, like any other mob boss, was very well connected within the industry, and amidst this time, the news of Jack Kirby being disappointed with the Marvel staff leaked. Knowing this, Infantino played to his strengths and approached Kirby with an offer he could not refuse: creative liberty and credit on the DC side. The poaching was a complete success. Kirby signed a 3-year contract with an extension option of 2 years, taking his talents to the rival side, with a chance to prove to Marvel that they had messed up. And with that motivation, Kirby would work until he built something that no one could take away from him, not even Marvel or Stan Lee. With full creative freedom, Jack Kirby would go forth and create his own corner of the DC universe entitled The Fourth World, where he would create the New Gods, Mr. Miracle, and other important DC figures like the one and only Darkseid. Altogether, these titles proved to be full of Kirby's creativity, and many invested comic readers picked them up regularly. To combat this, Marvel was quick to retaliate, and this led to a 5-year period where Marvel and DC would compete for the #1 monthly sales position, and as such, by ignoring Kirby at Marvel, Marvel created their own problem that they had to deal with. The most infamous form of hatred from the two companies came in the form of Marvel Comics copying DC Comics in the creation of characters, with a specific example being Thanos by Jim Starlin and Stan Lee after Kirby created the already famous Darkseid. Just take a look at these two characters and you'll notice some very obvious similarities. Another petty action taken by Marvel was the price baiting they did to trick DC into increasing the prices of their weekly issues, only to drop them in the last minute and become a more accessible option to the general public. With critical acclaim but decent sales numbers, Infantino was grateful for Kirby's work, but needed him to contribute more around the DC team. Kirby, being the team player he was, took on titles that no one else was working on for free, including Jimmy Olsen and Superman. Of course, somewhere along the way, the law did get involved. We'll keep it short, as it kind of ended up being a big nothing burger, but it is definitely something worth mentioning just to show how far apart the rift between Jack Kirby and Stan Lee grew. To summarize the 2014 settlement between the Kirby estate and the Marvel team, the internal dispute was mainly due to the power Kirby was given over his own creations at Marvel. Kirby and many other artists and writers at the Marvel imprint were considered work-for-hire workers. Under this clause, all work, creations, and products created by people like Kirby would fall completely under Marvel's ownership. This did things like prevent them from bringing their creations to other publications, and to also give Marvel the power to make executive decisions based on these creations. This was a standard industry practice at the time, and has only recently changed with new updated copyright law. However, at the time, Marvel was able to legally do whatever they wanted with the work of work from hires, including attributing it to other in-house talents, such as Kirby's work to Stan Lee. Kirby's family started sending termination notices to Marvel over characters like Spider-Man, X-Men, Captain America, Iron Man, Hulk, and many others after they were purchased by Disney and were going to start the MCU. However, because those materials were technically work made for hire at the time they were created, Marvel was considered the real author and the termination notices were considered invalid. However, later on, Kirby's estate started making more of an impact. Eventually, the Supreme Court ordered Marvel to issue a response of some sort. The response was essentially that the claims had no basis. However, amongst more pressure and an extremely dangerous lawsuit to Marvel that could result in them losing billions of dollars worth of material, they reached a settlement with Kirby's estate. We couldn't find the exact details of the settlement, specifically the money, but what came of it was that the newer issues of Marvel Comics now include a new credit line, created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. After all this, Kirby finally got the credit he deserved, the credit on the same level as the great Stan Lee. However, this is roughly 20 years after his passing, and although he ended up getting the credit he so desired his whole life, it begs the question, was it too little too late?
On February 6, 1994, Jack Kirby would pass away in Brooklyn with his family, and although he might have never gotten the full credit he thought he deserved, he created a legacy that would not be forgotten by the artists that would succeed him. Pioneering his own style of drawing and techniques, his name would lend itself to the Kirby Crackle, a specific way of drawing energy and force fields. After his death, Kirby's estate would continue his battle for ownership rights and credits for the character he believed he created. These legal battles would ensue until 2014, where Marvel would settle this case, paying the Kirby estate approximately $50 million, with further compensation for any upcoming projects using his work. Unfortunately, all of these settlements came after his death, and the sad reality is that Jack Kirby was never able to receive the complete credit or compensation whilst alive. Stan Lee would live until 2018, being able to witness a second revitalization of the Marvel brand in the mainstream media, via the form of movies and television series. Through this media revitalization, Stan Lee would have numerous chances of retaining the perception of his influence behind the Marvel brand through movie cameos and numerous convention appearances. In the end, the legacy of Lee still lives on in the works he helped co-create, but the work of Kirby not so much. Nonetheless, it is undeniable that the combined efforts of Lee and Kirby were what built Marvel from the ground up, but who you may see as the innovator behind the company may depend on what you value more, the writer or the artist.